I was staring at my empty bank account when I heard his car pulling out of the driveway for the last time. 23 years of marriage, and he left me with nothing but a note on the kitchen counter that still makes my hands shake when I remember it. My name is Rosa, and I'm 71 years old. Now, people always tell me I look younger, but the truth is, pain ages you in ways that wrinkles never could. I've lived long enough to know that some betrayals cut so deep they change the very chemistry of your blood. What my husband Richard did to me wasn't just theft. It was the systematic destruction of a woman who had given him everything. I found the note at 6:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was still in my pink robe, the one he bought me for our anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. The note was written in his careful handwriting, the same hand that had signed our marriage certificate all those years ago. Rosa, I never loved you. I only got you pregnant to steal your money. Don't look for me. That's when the whole ugly truth unraveled like a cheap sweater. Our daughter Sarah wasn't planned. She was bait. Richard had researched my family, knew about the inheritance I was expecting from my grandmother's estate. He had courted me, married me, and spent 2 decades waiting for the perfect moment to disappear with every penny. The bank statements were scattered across our kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. He'd been spending money for months, transferring it to accounts I didn't even know existed. The house was remortgaged, my grandmother's jewelry gone. Even the savings account I'd opened for Sarah's college fund was cleaned out to the last cent. But the cruelest cut was yet to come. I found the photographs, hidden in his desk drawer. Pictures of Richard with a woman half my age, her red hair cascading over his shoulder as they kissed in front of what looked like a beach house. On the back of one photo, he'd written, "My real life starts now," with a date from 6 months ago. 23 years of cooking. His favorite meals, ironing his shirts, supporting his career while I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. 23 years of believing in a love that was nothing more than an elaborate con game. The woman in the photographs was stunning, young, everything I hadn't been in decades. But there was something familiar about her smile that I couldn't quite place. I sat in that kitchen for hours, pieces of my shattered life spread around me like debris after a tornado. The silence was deafening. No more of Richard's morning coffee ritual, no more of his whistling in the shower, no more pretending that everything was normal when I'd felt the distance growing between us for years. That's when I made a decision that would have shocked the Rosa of 6 months ago. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd found in Richard's hidden contacts. A number labeled simply as M. If you're enjoying my story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about justice. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered, young, confident, with just a trace of an accent I couldn't identify. "Hello? Is this Richard's girlfriend?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. There was a pause. Then, "Who is this?" "I'm his wife." The silence on the other end of the line stretched like a taut wire about to snap. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, colder, more calculated. "Richard told me you were difficult to deal with." Difficult. After 23 years of marriage, that's how he described me to his mistress. I felt something inside me shift, like a door slamming shut on the woman I used to be. The Rosa who cried over burnt dinners and apologized for having opinions was gone. What sat in that kitchen chair was someone else entirely. "What's your name?" I asked. "Melissa. And before you start crying and begging, you should know that Richard and I are already married. We had the ceremony last month in Vegas. You're nobody to him now." The words hit me like physical blows, but I didn't cry. Something about her tone, so smug and rehearsed, made me suspicious. Richard was many things, a liar, a thief, a coward, but he wasn't stupid enough to commit bigamy. Unless, "Show me the marriage certificate," I said quietly. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I don't owe you anything. Richard chose me because I'm everything you're not. Young, beautiful, successful. He said you were just a stepping stone to get what he really wanted. That's when the pieces started clicking together. The familiar smile in the photographs, the confidence in her voice, the way she knew exactly what to say to hurt me most. This wasn't just some random affair. This was planned, orchestrated, personal. How long have you known my husband, Melissa? Another pause. Long enough to know he deserves better than a dried-up old woman who can't even keep her man. Interested. Her cruelty was so practiced, so effortless, that I realized this wasn't her first time destroying a marriage. But there was something else, a desperation underneath the venom. She was trying too hard to convince me of something. Where did you two meet? I pressed. That's none of your business. The beach house in the photographs. Is that where you're living now? The line went quiet. Too quiet. Then she made a mistake. How do you know about the beach house? The way she said it told me everything. She was surprised I knew about it, which meant Richard hadn't told her. About the photographs he'd hidden in our house. These two were keeping secrets from each other, too. I had spent decades reading people, customers at the diner where I worked, parents at Sarah's school events, neighbors who smiled to your face and gossiped behind your back. Melissa was hiding something big, and her overconfidence was going to be her downfall. I know a lot of things, dear, I said, my voice taking on the same honey sweetness I'd used when dealing with difficult customers. I know Richard transferred $340,000 from our joint account 3 days ago. I know he took out a second mortgage on our house. I know he cleaned out Sarah's college fund. So what? It's his money, too. Actually, it wasn't. My grandmother's inheritance came with very specific legal protections. Richard may have thought he was clever, but he committed a federal crime when he touched that money. For the first time, Melissa's voice wavered. You're lying. Am I? You see, sweetheart, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. My grandmother survived the Depression, and she made sure her money would never be stolen by charming men with empty promises. Every penny Richard took can be traced, and every penny carries a felony charge. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure about the legal protections, but my grandmother had been a sharp woman who didn't trust easily. It was worth the bluff to see how Melissa would react. Richard said you were powerless, she whispered. And for the first time, she sounded young and scared instead of cruel and confident. Richard says a lot of things, but I'm curious, Melissa. What did he promise you? A new life? Financial security? True love? He said after he got the money, we'd travel the world together. Start fresh somewhere beautiful. Poor girl. She had no idea she was just another mark in Richard's long game. But that familiar feeling nagged at me again. Something about her voice, her mannerisms, the way she'd been so ready with cruel words about my age and appearance. Melissa, what's your last name? Why? Because I think we've met before. The phone went dead. The dial tone echoed in my ear like a death knell, but I wasn't defeated. If anything, Melissa's panic had given me more information than hours of interrogation could have. She knew something about those legal protections, and her reaction told me she was far more involved in Richard's scheme than she wanted to admit. I've lived long enough to know that when someone hangs up on you, it's because you've hit a nerve they can't afford to have touched. That familiar feeling about Melissa's voice kept gnawing at me like a persistent toothache. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander back through the years, searching for that connection. Then it hit me like lightning. 25 years ago, when Sarah was just 3 years old, we'd hired a babysitter for the summer. A teenager from the neighborhood with red hair and a sweet smile who seemed to adore children. Her name was Melissa Thompson, and she'd been 17 when she spent 3 months caring for my daughter while I worked double shifts at the diner. I remembered her now, how she'd always asked detailed questions about Richard's work schedule, about our finances, about whether we had savings or investments. At the time, I'd thought she was just a curious kid from a poor family, impressed by our modest middle-class lifestyle. But now, with 25 years of hindsight, I could see the pattern. She'd been studying us. I rushed to the old photo albums in the hallway closet, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. There it was, a picture from Sarah's 4th birthday party. Melissa Thompson, 17 years old, holding my daughter while Richard cut the cake in the background. The same smile, the same calculating eyes, just wrapped in the innocence of youth. But this couldn't be the same person. The math didn't work. If she'd been 17 then, she'd be 42 now, not the 20-something woman in Richard's recent photographs. Unless... I called Sarah immediately. "Mom, are you okay? You sound strange." "Sarah, honey, do you remember our babysitter? Melissa from when you were little. The redhead?" "Vaguely. Why? Did she ever mention having family? Sisters? Daughters?" "Actually, yeah. She talked about her little sister a lot. Said she was going to make sure the kid had a better life than she did." "Mom, what's going on?" The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. The Melissa who had babysit Sarah wasn't Richard's girlfriend. She was the mastermind behind this entire operation. She'd spent months in our house, learning our routines, our weaknesses, our dreams. She'd planted the seeds of this con 25 years ago and waited patiently for them to bloom. The woman Richard was with now had to be her sister, trained, coached, and sent in to finish what Melissa Thompson had started a quarter-century ago. I hung up with Sarah and sat in the silence of my empty house, feeling the full weight of the deception that had shaped my entire adult life. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a long-term family business, and I'd been their mark since before Sarah could even walk. The old Rosa would have called the police, hired a lawyer, tried to work within the system that had already failed to protect me. But the woman sitting in that chair had moved beyond conventional justice. Some wounds require unconventional healing. I opened my laptop, a gift from Sarah last Christmas that I'd barely used, and began researching private investigators. But as I scrolled through the listings, a different kind of advertisement caught my eye. Discreet services, problem solving, no questions asked. I'd heard whispers about such people in the diner over the years. Customers who spoke in code about contractors who could handle situations that the law couldn't touch. I'd always dismissed those conversations as the fantasies of people who watched too many movies. But now, staring at the carefully worded websites offering specialized conflict resolution, I understood that some problems required specialized solutions. The number belonged to a man who called himself Marcus. His voice was calm, professional, like a doctor discussing a routine procedure. "I need someone found," I told him, "and I need them to understand that their actions have consequences." "What kind of consequences are we discussing, ma'am?" I thought about Sarah's college fund, stolen to pay for another woman's beach house. I thought about my grandmother's jewelry, probably pawned or sold to finance Richard's new life. I thought about 25 years of systematic manipulation that had started when my daughter was barely out of diapers. "The permanent kind," I heard myself say. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "That's a serious request. It requires serious consideration and serious payment." "How much?" $50,000. Half up front, half when the job is complete. I almost laughed. Richard had stolen more than 6 times that amount from me. Using his own theft to fund his punishment felt like poetry. "I'll need proof first," I said, surprising myself with how naturally this conversation flowed. "Proof of who they really are, where they are, and what they've done. Then we'll discuss the final solution." "That can be arranged. But ma'am, once we start down this path, there's no going back." "Are you certain this is what you want?" I looked around my empty house at the spaces where Richard's belongings used to be, at the kitchen table still covered with evidence of his betrayal. I thought about the Melissa sisters, probably celebrating their victory right now, toasting to the stupid old woman they'd been playing for 25 years. "I'm certain," I said. "But Marcus, I want them to know it's coming. I want them to understand exactly why this is happening before it happens." "That's unusual. Most clients prefer the element of surprise." "I'm not most clients. I want them to feel the same fear they made me feel. I want them to lie awake at night wondering when their past will catch up with them." It'll cost extra for the psychological component. Money is no object. They made sure of that when they stole mine. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of forgiveness or moving on, but the peace that comes with knowing you've stopped being a victim and started being an agent of your own justice. The old Rosa had died the morning I found that note. What remained was something harder, sharper, more dangerous than my husband and his accomplices could have ever imagined. Marcus called me back 3 days later with information that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. The professional detachment in his voice couldn't hide the fact that even he was impressed by what he'd uncovered. Mrs. Rosa, what you're dealing with isn't just a theft. It's a generational criminal enterprise. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same spot where I'd found Richard's note, but now I felt like a general planning a war rather than a victim nursing wounds. I'd spent those 3 days in a strange state of calm. Preparation, paying bills, organizing documents, writing letters to Sarah that I'd probably never send. Getting my affairs in order, as they say. Tell me everything, I said. The Thompson sisters have been running this con for over 30 years. Melissa Thompson, the older one who babysat your daughter. She's now 42 and goes by the name Michelle Torres. She's been the brains behind at least 12 documented cases of long-term marriage fraud across 4 states. My hands tightened around the phone. 12 families. That we could verify. The pattern is always the same. The younger sister Amanda, she's the one with your husband now, poses as the girlfriend while Melissa orchestrates from behind the scenes. They target middle-aged men with access to substantial savings or inheritance prospects. The relationships last just long enough to clean out the accounts before they disappear. And the authorities. They've been careful, never enough evidence to prosecute, and by the time victims realize the scope of the fraud, the money's already been laundered through offshore accounts. Your husband wasn't their first mark, Mrs. Rosa. He was just their most profitable. I thought about all those years Richard had seemed distant, distracted. All those business trips that lasted just a little too long. Phone calls he took in another room. Passwords he suddenly changed. How long had they been working on him? How long had I been living with a stranger? Where are they now? That's where it gets interesting. They're not in some tropical paradise like your husband probably promised. They're holed up in a compound outside Reno, Nevada. Turns out Michelle Torres has been planning her retirement, and she needs one final score to disappear forever. My money. Your money. But here's the thing, they're scared. After your phone call with Amanda, they've been making mistakes, moving money too quickly, arguing in public, changing their usual patterns. Amanda's been posting desperate messages on social media about needing to leave the country. Soon, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Fear makes people stupid. Exactly. And Mrs. Rosa, there's something else. We found records of phone calls between Michelle Torres and your husband dating back 15 years. This wasn't a recent seduction. She's been grooming him since your daughter was in middle school. The room spun slightly. 15 years. Sarah's entire adolescence, our anniversary trips, the quiet Sunday mornings when I thought we were rebuilding our marriage after the rough patches. All of it had been a lie. Richard had been playing the long game while I was living in a complete ignorance. How do you want to proceed? Marcus asked gently. I'd been thinking about this question for 3 days, and my answer surprised even me. I want them to experience what I experienced. The slow realization that everything they believe about their security is an illusion. The dawning horror that someone they trust has been planning their destruction. That's elaborate. They took 25 years of my life, Marcus. They don't get to die quickly. I outlined my plan, speaking with a clarity that came from somewhere deep inside me, some reservoir of strength I didn't know I possessed. Maybe it was my grandmother's blood, the woman who'd survived the Depression and 2 wars. Maybe it was just what happens when you finally stop being afraid. First, I want you to send them proof that I know who they really are. Photos, documents, evidence of their other victims. Let them understand that their carefully constructed identities are blown. That'll spook them into running. Good, because the second phase requires them to be desperate. I want you to freeze their accounts the same way they froze mine. Every penny they've stolen from every victim, I want it locked down tight. That's technically challenging, but not impossible. Third, I want Amanda to know that Richard never loved her any more than he loved me. I want her to understand that she's just another mark, another stepping stone in Michelle's plan. Let them turn on each other. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. And the final phase? The final phase happens when they're isolated, broke, and paranoid. When they're looking over their shoulders every minute of every day, wondering when their past will catch up with them. That's when you'll find them. Mrs. Rosa. What? You're describing isn't just assassination. It's psychological warfare. They declared war on me 25 years ago. I'm just finally fighting back. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The pure, clean satisfaction of knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do. If you've ever felt the weight of injustice crushing your spirit, you'll understand why this story means so much to me, and why I needed to share it with people who know that sometimes the only way to heal is to make sure the wound never heals for those who caused it. I pulled out a notepad and began writing letters. Not to Sarah this time, but to the Thompson sisters. Personal messages that Marcus would deliver at precisely the right moments to maximize their psychological impact. Each word was chosen like a surgeon choosing instruments, designed to cut deep and leave scars that would never fade. The old Rosa had believed in forgiveness, in turning the other cheek, in letting karma handle the justice. But karma, I'd learned, sometimes needs a little help from the living. Marcus's first strike hit them exactly 1 week later, and I watched it unfold through the security cameras he'd installed around their Nevada compound. Modern technology is a beautiful thing when you're 71 and planning the downfall of your enemies from the comfort of your kitchen table. The envelope arrived at their front door with no return address, just Amanda's name written in my careful handwriting. Through the camera, I watched her hands shake as she opened it and saw the photographs spill out like playing cards from a rigged deck. 25 years of crime scenes. Not violent ones, but devastation nonetheless. House after house left empty, family after family destroyed, all captured in neat little surveillance photos. But the real masterpiece was the letter I'd included, written in the same intimate tone I'd once used for love notes to Richard. Dear Amanda, or should I call you by your real name? Sarah Michelle Thompson, born April 3rd, 1983. Yes, sweetheart, I know exactly who you are. I know about the Peterson family in Ohio, 2019, the Williams couple in Texas, 2021, and especially the elderly Mr. Chen in California whose death you accelerated when the con was taking too long. I know because I've been watching you the same way you watched me. The difference is I'm better at it. Through the camera, I saw Amanda stumble backward, the photographs scattering across their expensive marble floor, marble bought with stolen dreams. She screamed for Michelle, her voice carrying that same panic I'd heard in our phone call, but amplified now into pure terror. Michelle appeared from another room, and for the first time I saw the older Thompson sister in person. Even at 42, she was stunning. The kind of woman who could convince any man to betray everything he'd ever believed in. But as she read my letter, I watched 20 years of careful confidence crumble in real time. How does she know about Mr. Chen? Michelle's voice came through crystal clear on Marcus's audio equipment. We were so careful with that one. Maybe because you weren't as careful as you thought, came a new voice that made my blood freeze. Richard stepped into the camera frame, but this wasn't the broken man I'd expected to see. He looked confident, relaxed, like a person who'd been holding back his true nature for decades. And when he smiled at Michelle's shock, I saw something in his expression that chilled me to the bone. You told her about Chen? Michelle whispered. I told her about all of them. You see, ladies, while you were playing your little games, I was playing a much bigger one. I grabbed the phone and called Marcus immediately. Are you seeing this? Every word. Your husband just confessed to being involved in multiple murders, Mrs. Rosa. This isn't just fraud anymore. On screen, Richard was pacing now, his hands animated as he spoke. Did you really think I was just some dumb mark you could manipulate? Michelle, darling, I've been running cons since before you hit puberty. You approached me 15 years ago thinking you were seducing another victim, but I let you seduce me because I needed partners, not prey. Amanda backed against the wall, her young face pale with understanding. You mean, this whole time, I was the one calling the shots. Rosa's inheritance was just the final score before we retired together. But then you, he pointed at Amanda, had to get greedy, had to push for the beach house, the expensive clothes, the public displays. You drew attention we couldn't afford. Michelle's composure finally shattered completely. So what now, Richard? You kill us both and take everything. Kill you? Oh, sweetheart, I don't need to kill you. Rosa's already taken care of that problem. All three of them froze. In that moment, watching through the camera, I realized that Richard had played a game so complex that even I had been seeing only one layer of it. But there was something in his tone, something in the way he said my name, that told me he wasn't done with his revelations. What do you mean? Amanda whispered. Richard walked to the window and looked directly at one of Marcus's hidden cameras, as if he knew I was watching. When he smiled, it was the same smile I'd fallen in love with 30 years ago, but now I could see the predator that had always lived behind it. I mean that my dear wife Rosa isn't the victim you thought she was. She's not even the woman you thought she was. He paused for dramatic effect, and I felt the ground shifting beneath me even though I was sitting in my own kitchen. Rosa Torres isn't her real name. It's Rosa Chen, Mr. Chen's daughter. The man you killed in California? That was her father. The camera captured Amanda's scream, Michelle's collapse into a chair, and my own reflected shock in the black computer screen. Through all of this planning, all of this revenge, I had forgotten the most important rule of any con game. Always assume you're not the only one playing. My phone rang. It was Richard. Hello, darling. His voice was warm, intimate, exactly like it had been on our wedding day. I assume you're watching. Marcus does excellent work, doesn't he? I should know. I've been employing his services much longer than you have. You killed my father. The words came out steady, cold, final. Your father was getting suspicious about Amanda's relationship with him. He was going to change his will, cut her out. We couldn't allow that to happen. But you, my beautiful Rosa, you were the real prize. Do you have any idea how long I searched for Chen's daughter? How carefully I orchestrated our meeting at that diner where you worked? The diner, where I'd thought we'd met by chance, where he'd charmed me with his shy smile and patient courtship. Even that had been a lie. 30 years, I whispered. 30 years of the longest con I've ever played. Marry the daughter, gain her trust, wait for the perfect moment to claim everything that should have been mine when her father died. You were never my wife, Rosa. You were my life's work. I was quiet for a long moment, watching through the camera as the Thompson sisters huddled together in terror, while my husband, my business partner, my father's murderer, stood calmly explaining 3 decades of deception. If you've ever discovered that your entire life was someone else's masterpiece of manipulation, you'll understand why this moment felt like death and rebirth happening simultaneously. When I finally spoke, my voice carried a tone I'd never heard from myself before. It was the voice of my father's daughter, the voice of a woman who'd just realized she'd been underestimated by everyone, including herself. Richard, darling, I said, my words dripping with the same false sweetness he'd used. You made one crucial mistake in your beautiful, complex plan. What mistake? Richard's confidence wavered for the first time in 30 years. I smiled, and through the camera, I watched his face change as he heard something in my voice he'd never heard before. the voice of a woman who'd been playing a longer game than any of them. Could imagine. You assumed I didn't know who killed my father. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. Through the screen, I watched Amanda grab Michelle's arm, both sisters finally understanding they'd been pawns in something much larger than their small time. "Kunza, that's impossible," Richard whispered. "You never said anything all these years. All these years I was waiting. You see, darling, my father didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me a letter, written the day before you killed him. A letter describing the young woman who'd been manipulating him, her older sister who coached her from the shadows, and the mysterious man they both answered to, a man they called the Architect." I paused, letting the weight of 30 years of patience settle into the silence. In that moment, I felt my father's presence with me, not as a ghost or a memory, but as the foundation of strength I'd built my entire adult life upon. My father was a smart man, Richard. Smart enough to hire private investigators when he suspected something was wrong. Smart enough to document everything. Smart enough to hide evidence where only I would find it after his death. I've known exactly who you were since our third date. Then why? His voice cracked like a teenage boy's. Why did I marry you? Why did I spend 30 years playing the perfect wife? Because my father's letter contained one final instruction. Make them pay, but make them pay everything. I stood up from my kitchen chair, feeling the full power of 3 decades of careful planning flow through me. I couldn't just have you arrested, Richard. I needed you to steal from me so you'd commit multiple federal crimes. I needed you to involve the Thompson sisters so they'd all be complicit. I needed you to feel safe enough to confess to murder on camera. Through the security feed, I watched Richard's legs give out as he collapsed into a chair. For 30 years, I'd watched those same legs carry him to our bed each night, never knowing they'd once carried him away from my father's lifeless body. The cameras, Marcus. Marcus has been working for me since before you stole your first penny. Every conversation, every confession, every detail of your criminal enterprise, it's all been recorded and transmitted directly to a very patient FBI task force. The beautiful part was watching it dawn on all 3 of them simultaneously. The compound they thought was their safe house was actually an elaborate trap I'd spent 2 years preparing. The money they'd stolen was already frozen and traced. The offshore accounts they'd relied on were being monitored by federal agents who'd been building a case for the better part of a decade. "But the hitman," Amanda whispered. "You hired someone to kill us." I laughed, and it felt good. The first genuine laugh I'd had in months. "Oh, sweetheart. Marcus isn't a hitman. He's a retired FBI agent who specializes in financial crimes. The permanent consequences I discussed weren't death. They were life sentences in federal prison." As if summoned by my words, the compound filled with the sound of vehicles, shouting voices, and orders being given through bullhorns. Through the camera, I watched my husband and his accomplices realize that their 30-year crime spree was finally over. Richard looked directly at the camera one last time. "Rosa, how long have you been planning this?" "Since the day I buried my father and found his letter." 30 years, Richard. The same amount of time you spent planning to destroy me. The difference is I'm better at it than you are. The FBI took them into custody with professional efficiency. Agent Patricia Morrison, who'd been the lead investigator on my father's cold case, called me personally that evening. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd waited decades to close a file that had haunted her entire career. "Mrs. Chen," she said, using my real name for the first time in 30 years. "We've been trying to catch the Thompson organization since 1995. Your cooperation made it possible to connect 14 murders across 6 states. 14. Families will finally have closure because of your patience. 14 murders. I sat with that number for a long time after we hung up. 14 people who might still be alive if I'd acted sooner, if I'd chosen immediate justice over perfect justice. But I've lived long enough to know that survivor's guilt is a luxury I can't afford. You can only save the people you can save, and you can only do it with the tools and knowledge you have at the time. The media circus lasted for weeks. The widow's 30-year con, they called it. Reporters camped outside my house wanting to know how a simple diner waitress had orchestrated the takedown of a criminal empire. They expected me to give interviews, to write a book, to cash in on my story the way victims turned heroes are supposed to do in our celebrity culture. But I disappointed them. I stayed silent, let my lawyer handle the press, and focused on what really mattered. Sarah. My daughter flew in from Seattle the day after the arrests, her face a mixture of shock, admiration, and something that looked dangerously close to fear. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where this whole story had started to unravel 6 months earlier, and I told her everything. About her grandfather's murder, about the letter, about the 30 years of careful planning that had shaped her entire childhood. "You let him be my father," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Knowing what he was, you let him walk me down the aisle at my wedding. I let him be the father you needed him to be," I corrected gently, "because my job was to protect you, not to burden you with a truth you weren't ready to handle, and because I knew that someday, when you were strong enough, you'd understand why I did what I did." Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing 3 decades of deception and protection in equal measure. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an echo of my own strength that I'd never heard before. "How do you live with that? 30 years of pretending to love someone you knew was a monster?" "Who said I was pretending?" I asked and saw her confusion. "Sarah, this is the hardest thing for anyone to understand, but I did love Richard. I loved the man he pretended to be. I loved the father he chose to be for you. I loved the husband he became in moments when he forgot to be a criminal. Love isn't always logical, sweetheart. Sometimes you love someone despite knowing exactly who they are." That conversation taught me something I hadn't expected. Forgiveness isn't about absolving someone of their crimes. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying their sins. I forgave Richard not because he deserved it, but because after 30 years of holding both love and hatred in my heart simultaneously, I was tired of the wait. The trials took 2 years. I testified in all of them, facing Richard and the Thompson sisters in courtroom after courtroom as prosecutors built their cases. Each time I spoke, I watched their faces for some sign of remorse, some acknowledgement of the lives they'd destroyed. I never found it. Richard got life without parole for my father's murder plus consecutive sentences for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Michelle Thompson received 40 years for her role in orchestrating the murders and fraud schemes. Amanda, because of her age when some of the crimes were committed, got 25 years with the possibility of parole. But the real victory wasn't their sentences. It was watching the families of their other victims finally get answers. Finally get justice. Finally get the closure that lets you stop looking over your shoulder and start looking toward the future. Mrs. Peterson from Ohio, whose husband had died 6 months after the Thompson sisters cleaned out their retirement account, sent me a letter that I keep in my father's Bible. "Thank you," she wrote, "for caring enough about strangers to wait 30 years for justice. Thank you for proving that evil doesn't always win. I'm 73 now, and my hair has gone completely silver, but people tell me I look younger than I did 2 years ago. There's something about finishing a life's work that rejuvenates the soul in ways that no amount of rest or vacation ever could. I still live in the same house where Richard left that note, but it feels different now. The shadows that used to make me jump have been replaced by the comfortable quiet of a space that belongs entirely to me. I've redecorated, of course, painted the walls the shade of blue my father loved, hung pictures of the family I chose rather than the family I was given. Sarah visits every month, sometimes bringing her children, my grandchildren who will grow up knowing their great-grandfathers. Real story. Understanding that justice sometimes requires extraordinary patience, and learning that the strongest people are often those who appear the most ordinary. I've thought often about the woman I was when this story began, standing in that kitchen 6 months ago, staring at an empty bank account and believing my life was over. She couldn't have imagined that her greatest devastation would become her greatest transformation. She couldn't have known that losing everything would teach her how much she was truly worth. The money was all recovered, of course. Richard's assets, the Thompson sisters' accounts, even the profits from crimes committed decades ago, all of it tracked down by forensic accountants and returned to victims or their families. But the real treasure was something no one could steal: the knowledge that I am my father's daughter, that I carry his strength, and his patience and his unwavering belief that justice, however delayed, will eventually find its way home. People ask me if I regret the 30 years I spent married to my father's killer, if I wish I'd acted sooner, chosen a different path, lived a different life. The answer is complicated. The way all honest answers are when you've lived long enough to understand that life rarely offers simple choices between good and evil. I regret that other people died while I waited for the perfect moment. I regret that Sarah grew up with a lie at the center of her family. I regret the nights I lay awake next to a murderer and wondered if I was becoming a monster myself by choosing patience over immediate action. But I don't regret the outcome. 14 families have closure. A criminal empire that operated for 30 years has been dismantled. Future victims who will never know they were saved have been protected. And I learned something about myself that I might never have discovered if my life had been easier. I am capable of anything when I decide to be. The woman writing these words is not the same woman who stirred stew in her kitchen while her husband planned her destruction. She is not the same woman who cried over empty bank accounts and broken promises. She is not even the same woman who hired what she thought was a hitman and planned what she thought was murder. I am someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the steel of patience. I am my father's daughter and my own woman, and the author of a story that took 73 years to write properly. If my story has touched you, if you recognize yourself in the woman I used to be or the woman I became, remember this: you are never too old to reinvent yourself, never too broken to rebuild. Stronger, and never too late to choose justice over vengeance, healing over hatred, transformation over surrender. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that survivors don't just endure. We eventually triumph. We outlive our enemies, outlast their schemes, and outgrow the people who tried to make us smaller than we are. Justice, I've discovered, is not a dish best served cold. It's a feast best served after decades of careful preparation, seasoned with patience, and shared with everyone who has ever been told they were powerless. And sometimes, the sweetest victory is not the destruction of your enemies, but the construction of a life so beautiful, so purposeful, so free, that their memory becomes nothing more than a footnote in the story of who you chose to become. I am Rosa Chen, daughter of a murdered man, survivor of a 30-year deception, and architect of my own justice. This is my story, and I'm not finished writing it yet.